Today, we'll be discussing the case of Jesica Santillan. Jessica was a girl who had a bright smile and was very family-oriented. She was born and grew up in Mexico, but after dealing with multiple health issues that weren't able to be treated in her hometown, Jessica and her family made the long journey to the United States to get better treatment for their daughter. After working hard to save up for the very expensive procedure, Jessica was finally able to get a heart and double lung transplant. But unfortunately, what this family thought would be the change of their lives for the better quickly turned into possibly one of their worst nightmares, because Jessica in fact got the surgery done. But to everyone's surprise, her body soon began to shut down. There was something very wrong with the organ transplantations they did. And it wasn't until the doctors traced back their steps when they realized the crucial mistake they made. Because what they soon found out was that Jessica was in fact given the wrong organs, and it didn't take too long for her body to completely shut down from this. Jessica unfortunately passed away from this botched procedure, and while this of course was upsetting to think about, you would be shocked to hear the reaction many had to her passing, because it didn't take too long for critics to latch onto this case, and many would soon begin to villainize and target Jessica and her family for what had happened. But just to introduce myself, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post anything involving medical mysteries and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. Alright, let's get into this case. Jesica Santillan was born on December 26, 1985 to parents Magdalena Santillan and Malicio Huerta in the village of Arroyo Hondo, Mexico. Arroyo Hondo was a tiny village 100 miles from Guadalajara, which according to a 2020 census is the 7th most populated city in Mexico. Jesica Elizabeth Santillan, with a Y, was her chosen birth name, but she preferred to go by Jessica, so I will be referring to her as Jessica going forward. The village she lived in was located in the western state of Jalisco, and it was about home to about 400 people at this time. This was a very small village that had an agricultural focus on sugar, with many cane fields and a sugar mill. Jobs were harder to find because of how rural this area was, and the village was considered poor by most standards due to the amount of people living in poverty. Jessica grew up in a house with her mother, siblings, cousin, aunt, and uncle, and they lived together as a large family in a small house. And her childhood home was described as having crumbling plaster walls and electrical wires dangling from the ceilings. Right from the beginning, it was clear that Jessica did not seem healthy. On her first night home from the hospital as an infant, she was vomiting blood. As she grew into a young child, Jessica still had vomiting problems, but had also begun to suffer from severe headaches. Nobody knew what was going on with her, but by 5 years old, a doctor in Mexico diagnosed Jessica with anemia and prescribed her iron pills. Despite this, Jessica still had symptoms, and another doctor soon suggested it might be a heart murmur, but there was no confidence or agreement of what was wrong with Jessica. While in school, teachers would witness Jessica have fainting episodes, and with how concerned they were, her family began trying to find the best medical care they could. It would finally be after 12 years when they would get the answers they were looking for. When Jessica was 12 years old, she and her family traveled to the States to go see a doctor over in Texas, and it was there when she would finally receive a diagnosis for her condition. Jessica was diagnosed with something called restrictive cardiomyopathy. This is a fatal illness in which the left ventricle of the heart fails to fill with blood, which cuts off oxygen to the heart. Jessica was considered to have graduated from school after completing the 6th grade in 1997, and it was after that when she worked as a maid in her neighbor's house. Now, throughout that time, she was still dealing with fainting spells and fatigue from her illness, and this was still very concerning for her family, especially because her family was told that the doctors in their area did not have the expertise or resources to help Jessica. At the time, they had to really think about it and came to the conclusion that to help Jessica, they might just need to go to the United States, especially because Jessica's mom, Magdalena, had a sister in North Carolina who told them about a hospital that could help Jessica. And this hospital was in Durham, North Carolina, which had been nicknamed the City of Medicine. So the family saw this as a good sign. And factoring the healthcare they would now have for Jessica and the possible job opportunities for all of them, especially with moving to a bigger city, they soon enough made the tough decision to immigrate. The family worked hard to save their money for the move, and they all pulled their money together to pay for someone who is said to be referred to as a coyote to help them. A coyote is said to be a slang term for a person who helps guide or smuggle people immigrating across the Mexico-US border. And it cost the family $5,000 for them to guide Jesica, her brother Ulysses, her sister Dulce, her mother Magdalena, and her father Mauricio through the Sonoran Desert across the border and across a few states into Texas. And I mean, this was not an easy trip. The trip was very dangerous. At some point while in the desert, they ended up getting robbed. And unfortunately, they lost all of their money and their valuables, including Jessica's earrings, which the robbers made her take off. Fortunately, though, the family came out unharmed and they were able to reach out to relatives and other contacts that helped them get from Texas to North Carolina. When they arrived in North Carolina, they knew some of the first things they needed to do was set up a home, earn some money, and have a place to live so Jessica would be able to get her treatments. Mauricio was able to get a job as a construction worker, and Magdalena took a job as a housekeeper for Louisburg College. In doing this, they were able to settle into a trailer for the family to live in. Now, as the days went by, Jessica's condition was getting worse, and doing this long trip they just completed did not help. Whatever she tried to do, something, even if it was a little bit strenuous, she was getting out of breath. And this was something that happened constantly. Soon enough, they ended up bringing Jessica to the hospital that Magdalena had heard about and suggested, called Duke Medical Center. When they arrived and Jessica was evaluated, the doctors told her and her family that Jessica had also developed something called pulmonary hypertension. This is a condition where the blood pressure in the blood vessels that lead from the heart to the lungs is too high, and it can cause fatigue, shortness of breath, dizziness, chest pressure, and many more symptoms, which are all symptoms that Jessica had been experiencing. If left untreated, this is a condition that would continue to progress. During the spring of 2000s, doctors at Duke had recommended that Jessica receive a heart transplant and double lung transplant to treat her conditions. However, the problem was the family was still struggling financially, and because they had entered the country without legal permission, they did not qualify for Medicare or other financial assistance. For them, the surgery was going to cost $500,000. But the family knew that Jessica needed to get this done, and they soon turned to their community for help as they began to plan fundraisers through local churches and civic groups. During the family's fundraising efforts, a local newspaper had actually published a story about Jessica. The article told the daring tale of a family that risked it all to provide hope for their child, and it further went on to ask the community to assist. Many people read this article and donated some money. But there was one person in particular who stood out from the community, and this was a man named Mack Mahoney. Mack was a local home builder and prominent member of the community. Just a note, some sources have his name spelled as Mack without a K and others Mack with a K. So that's just of note. Mack would often partake in local events and would sometimes help out with local politicians. He was from Texas and was described by many as a cowboy. He often spoke harshly and expressed strong opinions, and it was said that with his cowboy hat and boots, he often gave off a tough appearance. About 20 years before this case, Mack had actually lost his son to a medical error. Because of this, he greatly understood how hard it was to get proper treatment. He saw Jessica's story in the newspaper and ended up reaching out to the family. And in part because of his time in Texas, Mack spoke Spanish, so it was easy for him to communicate with them. Mack realized that the family was struggling worse than he thought. He realized that they were having trouble asking for help and getting resources because Magdalena and Mauricio didn't speak any English, and this made it harder for them to communicate with others. Additionally, they were still living in the trailer and were barely able to afford normal household expenses, let alone the medical bills that Jessica would require. And because Max saw all the struggles they were going through, he offered to begin paying out of pocket for much of Jessica's treatment, and he even bought the family some of the basic necessities that they needed. All in all, it's likely he probably spent tens of thousands of dollars on Jesica. Before Jesica could be considered for the transplant, she had to undergo some other treatments. They tried multiple rounds of cardiac catheterizations, and each of these procedures would cost Mack $7,000. Overall, this was taking a great toll on everyone, and Mack ended up realizing that Jessica's transplant would be a lot of money for him to pay for himself. For a while, he was just thinking about what else he could do, and because of this, in August of 2000, Mack established a charity called Jesica's Hope Chest. This was a nonprofit organization meant to fund surgeries and medical expenses for deserving children. To this day, its website, forjhc.org, can be accessed through the Wayback Machine. The mission statement of the nonprofit is as follows: Jesica's Hope Chest, Inc., a foundation for critically ill children, is dedicated to helping critically ill children up to the age of 18 years old, but not past the child's 18th birthday. Jesica's Hope Chest will assist families with critically ill children and help cover costs of necessities which are not covered by private medical insurance and/or government medical assistance programs such as Medicaid and Medicare. Mack used the nonprofit and his skills as a builder to help raise money, and eventually he ended up building a house with donated materials and volunteer carpenters, and explained that the profit from its sale would go to Jesica's Hope Chest. Soon enough, they were able to sell the house, and because of this, they were able to also pay for Jesica's transplant. This wasn't all with Mack. In addition to helping them raise the funds, Mack was also given power of attorney over Jesica's health. He thought that this would be helpful, seeing as her parents could not easily communicate due to the language barriers, and he soon became the media's connection to Jesica's stories, constantly doing interviews and talking to the press about it. In May of 2000, the Duke Medical Center placed Jesica on a waiting list for organ donation, and after that happened, the family would just have to wait for Jesica's turn for that to happen. In the States, there are specific guidelines in place for how donated organs are distributed. Anyone who is deemed in need of an organ transplant is added to a waiting list run by the United Network for Organ Sharing, or UNOS, which is a nonprofit contracted by the United States government specifically for the purpose of running this waiting list. In order to be added to the waiting list, there are a few steps that the UNOS recommends. Usually, you would start by receiving a referral from your physician to a transplant hospital. You would then pick a transplant hospital and be evaluated there. Finally, if the staff there determine that you are a good candidate for an organ transplant, you will be added to the waiting list. These different teams at transplant hospitals get to decide what an eligible candidate looks like. However, every transplant program has slightly different rules and regulations as to who can get an organ donated to them. Common rules might include being younger than 80 years of age, being in stable enough condition for surgery, and having the ability to take long-term medication. Other possible rules that are more specific could be things such as recovery from addiction, particularly for those who smoke to receive lung transplants, or for those addicted to alcohol to receive liver transplants. And it's interesting because even if one hospital decides that you are not eligible for their program, you still could be eligible somewhere else due to the differences in their policies. Once accepted into the waiting list, a person would essentially just have to wait until an organ is ready for them. Thing is, organs are not always readily available and often become available randomly. The person waiting the longest is not always the first choice to get the transplant. Whenever an organ is donated, there are different ways that a recipient is chosen. And while wait time is factored into the decision, there are many other factors that are taken into account as well, especially because donated organs need to be from a donor kind of similar to the recipient. Height, weight, blood type, and genetic makeup are all considered, which makes sense. A child-sized kidney would be better donated to another child than to a very large adult. A heart from a donor with type A blood cannot go to a recipient with type B blood. Another factor considered is how far away the donated organ is from the recipient. Shorter distances are better to prevent needing to preserve the organ for longer periods of times, as organ transplants are considered far more successful when the organ is more fresh. And another very major factor typically considered is urgency. If a patient's death is imminent without transplant, they would rank higher than someone whose organ is still functioning enough for them to live. It may sound strange, but there's almost a type of point system that ranks people on the wait list when an organ becomes available. To prevent some of the possible bias, since 1999, there has been a statistical modeling program through a computer system which they use to rank people. Depending on which organ is being transplanted, different test results and medical information are entered to determine an urgency score. The computer then tries to filter the list by removing those whose record says they don't have the proper blood type or are too different in height or weight. After this, the remaining people who would be able to accept the organ are then sorted depending on their urgency score and their distance. With the ranking, the person at the top of the list is offered the organ first. Now, if they say no or are unable to take the organ immediately for whatever reason, it's then offered to the next person on the list. The thing is, these offers are for the person on the waiting list. However, they don't actually contact the person directly. It's actually the transplant program at the hospital that receives the offer on behalf of the person, and it's them who make the decision on whether to accept it or reject it. While the system has been in place since 1999, throughout the years, it has been updated and changed over time. On February 6, 2003, after approximately a 9-month wait, Jesica's family had received a call from the transplant team. And when they answered, the transplant team had informed them that Jesica had been selected to receive the organs that she needed. Now, the organs had initially been offered to 2 other patients, but one person was not the right size for the organ and the other was not ready for surgery at that time. So instead, even though she wasn't on the original selection list, the chief of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery, Dr. James Jaggers, asked if Jesica could be the recipient of the organ. And soon enough, Carolina Donor Services, which is the agency that facilitates communication between Carolina hospitals and the UNOS, agreed to let Jesica receive the organs. Now, Duke had a specific employee whose job was to procure and transport organs. At the time, this person was named Dr. Shin Ho, and at 9 a.m. on February 7th, 2003, Dr. Ho flew on a chartered plane to Boston where the organs were waiting. Throughout the pickup process, it was a total of 3 times Dr. Ho was told that the organs he was picking up were blood type A, and soon enough, he confirmed the information and was on his way to transport the organs back to North Carolina. They left Boston at 3:15 p.m. and were back in North Carolina by 5:49 p.m. And as soon as the organs had arrived, they quickly got to doing the operation, led by surgeon Dr. Jaggers. After getting Jesica situated for the surgery, Dr. Jaggers removed her heart and lungs, and immediately after, the new organs were brought into the operating room and transplanted into Jesica. Now, these organs looked good, and they appeared to be a great fit for her body size. And after they implanted them in, Jesica was taken off of the heart and lung bypass machine so that they could test the new organs. So by that point, Jesica was no longer on a ventilator, and they observed her to make sure that everything was going well. And everything seemed to be going well. Her heart was beating, her lungs were breathing on their own. She looked just fine. But it was only after 40 minutes when something unexpected started to occur, because they soon noticed that the functioning of Jesica's organs began to deteriorate. Her heart was no longer beating in a strong, normal rhythm, and her lungs were unable to make deep and meaningful breaths. Something was happening to Jesica's body, and it rapidly was getting worse. Jesica began to have seizures. Her organs turned from a healthy red to a dark purple. There was bleeding, and she began to have acute renal failure. Soon enough, they quickly had to put Jesica back on a ventilator to aid in her breathing. Now, it would be over the next few days, Jesica would drift in and out of consciousness, but for the most part, she was mainly drifting out. Not too long after, she was suffering from heart attacks and seizures, and was eventually moved to the ICU. And it would only be a brief moment of consciousness when she was able to speak. And at that moment, she mustered up the strength to yell out, quote, "Help me, Mac. I can't believe I'm dying." Now, the doctors, the staff, they were trying to figure out what was going on and what was wrong or what went wrong with this procedure. As soon as the problems began occurring, the transplant immunology laboratory was on it, just running tests to figure out what went wrong. And soon enough, they in fact got their answer and immediately called Dr. Jaggers to tell him the news, because they found out there had been a mismatch of blood types between the donor and the recipient. They gave Jesica organs from a donor who had been blood type A. However, Jessica's blood type was type O. Everyone in the world has blood that falls into a specific group: A, B, AB, or O. These groups are assigned based on antigens in your blood. Antigens are basically tiny molecules that your immune system is able to recognize. So in simpler terms, an antigen is any substance that causes or triggers the body to make an immune response against it. A person with type A blood has type A antigens. A person with B has B antigens. AB has both A and B antigens, and O has no antigens. Your body recognizes that the antigen associated with your blood type is supposed to be there, so it won't trigger an immune response. But if there's something foreign in your blood, so for example, antigens from another blood type, your body will produce something called antibodies. And antibodies are an important part of your immune system because these are proteins that will recognize unfamiliar antigens and will attack them. If a new antigen is introduced to the body, the immune system will attack it as an intruder. Organ transplants don't always need to be from the same blood type, but they need to be from a blood type that does not introduce a new antigen. Now, there are considerations that need to be made on whether their blood type is positive or negative, but for a general understanding, someone with the blood type AB can accept any organ donation because their body already recognizes all the antigens as part of the body. Someone with blood type A or B can accept an organ from their respective matching type, so A or B. And because O's have no antigens, they can only accept blood from other type O's and are able to donate to others who aren't of O blood type. However, O positive does have some limitations, whereas O negative has the ability to donate to all blood types, which is why O negative blood is considered to be the universal donor. I'll put a chart on the screen that summarizes pretty much everything that I'm talking about. Anyway, Jesica had blood type O positive, and her transplant organs came from a donor with type A blood. This means that the organs that they transplanted introduced type A antigens into her body. And because her immune system did not recognize them as safe to be there, her immune system began to attack the new organs. That is why Jessica's organs turned purple and stopped functioning. Her immune system was killing the new organs. Duke immediately informed the UNOS that there had been an issue and had told them that Jesica was in dire need of new organs. They had to put her on life support and dialysis, and they were pumping her full of anti-rejection medication. Thing is, these drugs can negatively affect organ function, and her body was in fact beginning to shut down. Jesica was lingering in a coma-like state, and the urgency for what she needed pushed her to the top of the waitlist. They had decided that Jesica was owed a chance because she never was given a proper first transplant, and so rejected organs should not count against her. Problem was, getting a full set of both lungs and a heart are not common, so some must have been reasonably worried that this would not be possible so soon. But by some miracle, on February 20th, 13 days after the initial transplant, Duke had received a call that organs were in fact available for Jesica, and this gave them the chance to try to fix their mistake. Dr. Jaggers was the one who again performed the transplant, and the organs again fit well and seemed to be accepted. However, things didn't turn out how they expected, and they in fact got worse. The additional surgery caused Jessica's body so much stress, it soon began to react and things were not looking good. Now, during transplant surgeries, the patient's blood would be circulated through a machine instead of the heart so that the heart can be removed. Now, while this is happening, it is possible that the blood can have problems with clogging inside of these bypass machines, and because of this, it is often treated with a large amount of anticoagulant drugs. The thing is about these drugs, though, are that they increase the risk of bleeding in and around the brain. And unfortunately, Jesica ended up experiencing this side effect. This bleeding caused irreversible damage, and her brain soon started swelling and she began experiencing intracranial bleeding. Not only this, but her kidneys also began to fail and her body was truly just shutting down. 2 days later, at 1:25 p.m. on February 22nd, an EEG showed that there was no brain activity, and a perfusion scan showed that her brain was not receiving blood flow. So although the life support machines were keeping Jessica's body alive, by that point, she was already brain dead, and Duke decided it was time to stop stop trying and that they were going to be taking her off of life support. Jessica's parents were far from willing to give up on their daughter. They begged for another opinion, and Mack demanded for a doctor outside of Duke to be consulted. But despite the protests, Duke did not agree. They argued that because Jessica was brain dead, she was no longer required to receive any treatment. And Duke explained that if this was a vegetative state or coma, they would have allowed a consultation and for her to remain on life support. But by that point, with her being brain dead, she was essentially already gone, and they were sticking with their decision. Later in the evening at 5:07 p.m., Jessica's heart stopped beating, and just 3 minutes later at 5:10 p.m., Duke took Jessica off ventilator support, and she was declared legally dead. There are many things that went wrong in this case, because Jessica's passing should have been avoidable. For one problem was that before performing the operation, Dr. Jaggers had never asked what the blood type of the donor was, because instead he assumed that if Carolina Donor Services told him that Jessica could have the organs, that they must have confirmed that they were compatible. Now, on the other hand, when Dr. Ho went to pick up the organs in Boston, he was told multiple times that the donor organs were blood type A. The thing is, he didn't know that this was an issue because no one had told him what blood type Jessica was. And where this further was messed up was that when the organs arrived, ABO blood typing tests were not completed before they were implanted. Regarding the responses, Duke Medical Center referred to this as a lack of redundancy. There was no double checking in the system they were using. No one had asked about the donor and Jessica's compatibility. Dr. Jaggers knew Jessica's blood type, but never checked the organs before surgery, which were labeled as blood type A. Dr. Ho was never even informed of Jessica's blood type, and when the facility in Boston tried to confirm compatibility, Dr. Ho just said it was okay because he had no way to know if it was right or wrong. Duke tried to claim that there was no specific entity who was at fault. They said that there wasn't one doctor that could be blamed, but rather that it was the system that had failed. And they also included the UNOS and Carolina Donor Services as part of this failed system. While it is true that everyone shared a part in Jessica's tragedy, it is a very important note that Carolina Donor Services broke their internal policy by not confirming what the recipient's blood type was, and that Duke was found to be deficient in the following federal guidelines in their organ transplant procedures. Now, all of this was definitely horrible and a mess in itself, but the aftermath of Jessica's passing was also very questionable. After Jessica passed away, the doctors at Duke had asked Jessica's family if they wanted to donate Jessica's organs after everything, because while not every organ was in usable condition, some were, and those still would be able to save others. And Jessica's family thought that this was a good idea. They thought that since Jessica had been lucky, if you will, to receive the second transplant, that someone else would also be lucky if they donated it, and that maybe this could make her passing a bit less tragic by helping others. Now, although her family was initially on board with this, Mack was far from being for this idea. In fact, Mack ended up telling Jessica's parents that doctors were murderers and that they would end up hurting other patients too. Not only this, but he also said that the doctors had told him that because Jessica had been taking very high doses of anti-rejection drugs, her organs were not viable for donation. Mack even went further to say that they needed to do an autopsy so that they could sue the doctors and that they wouldn't be able to do this without having the organs. On February 24th, 2 days after Jessica passed, Mack had helped arrange for Jessica to receive an autopsy. He knew that in order for him to sue, he would need a conclusive cause of death to prove that Duke was at fault. They needed proof as to what caused her death, whether it was her underlying heart condition, the rejection organs with the wrong blood type, or if it was something else unknown. Now, the autopsy was conducted and it was facilitated by the chief medical examiner, Dr. John Butts. And in the autopsy report, Dr. Butts wrote that, quote, "Given the historical circumstances and the autopsy findings, it is my opinion that this young woman's death was the result of global cerebral hypoxic injury that was a complication of the rejection of an incompatible heart-lung transplant." This meant that the autopsy confirmed that Jesica had passed away because her brain did not receive enough oxygen and could no longer function, but that this was a direct result of her body rejecting the organs from the first transplant. The autopsy also showed that in the days before her passing, Jesica had renal failure and possibly had a stroke, and it is also believed that these were caused by the incompatible organs. After the autopsy, Jessica's family was finally able to grieve, and on February 26, 2 days after the autopsy occurred, a memorial service was held by their community in North Carolina. Multiple clergy members and ministers came to pray with the group, some of varying religions, and Jesica was shown inside a white coffin with many stuffed animals and rosary beads in her hands. Now, the family had wanted to bring Jesica home to Mexico for burial, but after speaking with an immigration lawyer and some politicians, they realized that this would be more complicated than expected. Throughout the case, the Santillan family had been widely publicized by the media and by critics, being described as illegal immigrants who were stealing from the States. A lot of people viewed them this way, as opposed to others who viewed them as a family just trying to help their daughter. And with this criticism, there was a chance that if the family accompanied Jessica's body back to Mexico, that they would be unable to re-enter the United States. Some government officials from the United States and Mexico tried to see what promises could be made, but in the end, there was just nothing set in stone. However, Mexico said that they could in fact promise the return only if the family ended up suing Duke and needed to return for legal proceedings. And the United States just said that they doubted that the family would be deported after everything, but that they could not guarantee anything. Jessica's mother, Magdalena, did not want to file a lawsuit or sue. She knew that if they did sue, this would mean they would have to go through all of this again in court. And this was just something she did not want to do. So Mack had helped Magdalena get a lawyer who he thought was qualified, and the lawyer talked to Duke directly in hopes of reaching an agreement outside of court. Mack didn't really have any other options for them, and overall, due to these worries, the family went on to work with this lawyer and went forward with a funeral in North Carolina. Jessica and her white coffin were put inside a mausoleum and sealed with pink granite, and approximately 100 people had gathered to pay their respects. After approximately a year and a half since Jessica's passing, the lawyer the family was working with was able to reach an agreement with Duke, which was soon approved by a court. Both parties have a court order that details of the settlement, including the amount of money, are to remain confidential. However, it is believed that Mack received the money from this settlement, supposedly for Jessica's hope chest. The media coverage of Jessica's story could be divided into two parts: her story leading up to the first transplant, during the transplant, and even after she was suffering from the incompatible organs, were the first half. But the second half started when Jessica received the second transplant. In the beginning, the media sources described Jessica as this young and frail girl. Even though Jessica was 17 by the time of the first transplant, she was petite, which made her appear younger than her age in her photos. To the media, she was desperate for help and deserving of prayers. When referring to where the family came from, no mention of their immigration was usually made. Jessica was simply described as being Mexican. The newspapers and journalists described her as a child that we should provide for. Donation and prayer requests were answered without a second thought. They viewed her as this desperate, ill child who needed the community's support. This type of language continued when Jessica's body started rejecting the organs. She was also still just described as being Mexican, but with some mentions of the journey they had made to receive treatments she had. One source, for example, saying, quote, Jessica became a symbol of hope for many children with life-threatening illnesses. But this view didn't last that long because the media soon shifted once Jessica received the second organ transplant. It was very quickly when the journalists changed the way they spoke about her. They swapped from describing her as this girl from Mexico who had bravely traveled for help to describing her as this illegal alien or illegal immigrant who had come to steal resources. For example, one source criticizes the family, saying, quote, her illegal immigrant parents will probably sue Duke University. A caller on a radio station speaking of Jessica also expressed, quote, how dare this ethnic slur come into our country and take the organs of not one, but two people that could have gone to more deserving Americans. Now a couple Americans may die because of this illegal alien. Even, quote, In all likelihood, taxpayers will be on the hook for Santillan's post-operative care one way or another. For many, it was considered okay for Jesica to get the first transplant, as that was almost a basic medical need, especially considering how sick she was and how much she needed it. But there was such a stark contrast in description when people thought that Jesica was given too much. They thought that she was treated with privilege and were upset that this could happen. Many in the media and even the general public were caught up by the idea that a person who had immigrated without legal permission may be stealing their resources and that their tax dollars would have to pay for the entire situation. But in reality, a lot of people didn't realize, one, the true facts of the situation, or two, that a human, a teenage girl, suffered and passed away tragically and not at her fault. At the time of Jesica's case in the early 2000s, statistics showed that a larger percent of non-citizens in the United States donated their organs than those who received an organ transplant. In 2001, there were approximately 12,617 organ donors. Additionally, 5.2% of organ donors in the United States were not of U.S. citizens that year, and of that group, 2.8% of organ donors were green card holders. That means about 66 organ donors were not U.S. citizens in 2001, and about 35 of those were green card holders. If we think about the organs that can be donated, which are the heart, the 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, liver, pancreas, and intestines, that means up to 100,936 organs could have been donated at that time. This is just what it could have gotten up to if everything was perfect, but it is of note that living donors cannot donate all of these organs, and it is unlikely that every organ was usable for every deceased donor. So realistically, this number is lower, but it's still a general area. Up to 528 of these organs could have come from someone who was not a U.S. citizen. In 2001, there were 23,848 organs transplanted into an organ recipient. 3.8% of organ recipients in 2001 were not U.S. citizens. That means that only about 91 organs went to someone who was not a U.S. citizen. Now, even though 91 organ recipients is higher than 66 donors, this works out because of the fact that a donor can donate multiple organs. And this showed that people who were not U.S. citizens were giving more organs to the system than they were taking. And this trend was consistent during the 90s and early 2000s. By including non-citizens in the organ donation system was not only more ethical, but it actually had a greater amount of organs to give recipients. As physicians also take an oath to do no harm, it is unethical for them to turn away a transplant request based upon citizenship alone. However, the United Network for Organ Sharing, or the UNOS, did have a limit on the percentage of organ recipients that can be non-citizens during the late 90s and early 2000s. In one calendar year, any center doing organ transplants cannot allow more than 5% of their transplants to be non-citizens. Moreover, there are no limitations or restrictions on how many non-citizens are able to donate organs. Overall, citizens are still favored in the long run by this system due to non-citizens donating more organs than they receive. Now, in modern times, these rules have changed. There is no longer any limit on how many transplants can go to non-citizens. However, transplant centers must keep data on how many of their organs go to citizens versus non-citizens. And this data is to be made available at request to ensure transparency. So not only did the stats just show that she wasn't stealing, but also it's important to point out that Jesica in fact had health insurance. Although her immigration status made her ineligible for Medicare, her mother had actually paid for health insurance through her job. The health insurance that they were actually paying for was able to cover about 80% of the medical expenses. And then the money they received from Jesica's Hope Chest was able to cover the rest of the expenses. So overall, general tax money and public funds were not needed to fund the transplants. In fact, in recent years, it is estimated that about half of the people who have immigrated to the United States without legal permission actually pay for their own health insurance. Because of their undocumented status, they're not eligible for subsidized coverage, Medicaid, or other federally funded insurance options. However, they often are paying the full price for coverage without any discounts or assistance. So a lot of the media and public just had a misconception from the actual facts from the case. But even without the facts disproving a lot of the critics, either or, with this case, it's really just important to really think about The person as a person. Since Jessica's passing, everyone has since tried to settle into their new normal. Mauricio, Jessica's father, moved back to Mexico. Magdalena stayed in North Carolina with Mack and his wife, Nita, and the three of them continued working for the charity for a while. However, the charity seemingly came to an end in 2010 as they claimed that the changing economy made it difficult to continue raising money for those in need. And in addition to the charity closing, more things also began coming out about Mack. In about 2013, there were some allegations that Mack may also have been embezzling money from the nonprofit because they discovered that in 2004, $90,000 of the cash donations from the nonprofit had been only recorded as $9,000 on tax forms. And in total, over the years the charity was open, it was said that they had raised approximately $450,000. However, records only show that $100,000 went to families in need and $83,000 went to grants or other allocations. The rest of the money does not seem to be accounted for. Likewise, when the nonprofit closed in 2010, they claimed that they had just $10 left in their account. The nonprofit also owned 3 pieces of property that they carried out their businesses and used for different things, such as office space, for example. In 2009, they claimed that they sold these properties because of damage from a lightning strike. However, these properties were not adjacent, so it seems unlikely that all of them were hit by lightning. Also, investigation teams did not see damage, and board members and previous directors were not allowed to see financial records. Only Mack was able to. Furthermore, Mack and Nita ended up filing for bankruptcy later with $1.3 million in debt. And with this, there was also accusations of them writing checks that they knew they didn't have the funds to cover. More information is not available on this, but it does paint a picture that Mack was allegedly taking money from the nonprofit and using the nonprofit to benefit his construction business, which is especially interesting because there were actually some questionable allegations that had come out about Mack initially in 2004, and these allegations were made by a woman named Nancy Rommelman. Nancy is a journalist and writer who had met Mack and Jessica's family while following Jessica's case very closely at the time. In her original LA Weekly story posted on February 19, 2004, titled Grief's Gravity, Nancy described the things she had experienced and witnessed during her time with Mack and Jessica's family. And now, in a recent post from her website, Make More Pie, on January 22nd, 2023, Nancy shared how in August 2019, she was allegedly contacted with more information from Jessica's younger half-brother and later was contacted from the mother of the child whose organs were donated to Jessica. And in this post, she shared how, quote, the sudden and synchronized correspondences kindled Rommelman's long-held sense that there was more to revisit regarding Jessica's story, thus prompting her idea to possibly start an investigative podcast on the case titled Double Sacrifice. Since that first story in February 2004, Nancy shared how Mack allegedly said some very derogatory things about Jessica and her family, and that he may have been involved in Jessica's case for ulterior motives. Now, just keep in mind, Nancy's post was all the information I was able to find on the situation, so I do have to say that it is all alleged. However, the information on her page included some interesting details about what she claimed had happened. Nancy said that when visiting Jessica's gravesite, Mack referred to Jessica saying, quote, she was a pretty famous girl in Lewisburg. I made her famous. And that in addition to saying this, she claimed he told her that he had the rights to Jessica's story and even asked Nancy many times how he would be able to copyright Jessica's name. Nancy said that as more and more of these statements were coming from Mack, that she realized, quote, it was becoming clear Mack meant to control Jessica's legacy as he'd controlled her life. It appeared as though Mack and his wife Nita seemed to believe that because he put all of his resources and time to care for her, he should be the one to have ownership of Jessica's story. Like mentioned, Mack seemed to always be on the news or doing interviews for a lot of this case and was often kind of in the limelight because of it. With her being 17 and looking very young, Jessica's story opened the eyes of many to cases of medical error, especially in cases involving children, and she had intense media coverage on her case because of this. At first, her story was about the horrors of medical errors, but once she got the second transplant, that was when it became a story about immigration and healthcare rules. And while there was obviously both positive and negative publicity coming towards the case, publicity in general was important because it brought more eyes to the case and was said to be helpful in ensuring that Duke University Hospital and the UNOS were held accountable. The thing that was strange was that from the post, it appears that Mack did seem to want the publicity, but not necessarily for the right reasons. From what's alleged, it seemed as though Mack built this image to have the public and media infantilize Jesica, that he needed Jesica to be an angel so that he could be a hero. For example, Nancy claimed that Mack had told her that he would apparently buy Jesica more childlike clothes as opposed to adolescent-like clothes that she wanted so that she could fit the public image of the hopeless child with her heroic savior. He allegedly said, quote, "But I would not buy her some of the stuff she wanted, hip huggers and midriff tops. I told her that stuff makes you look like a little slut." And Nancy wrote that Mack had even tried setting up a meeting on live TV with Jesica's mother, Magdalena, and the mother of Jesica's first donor with the different blood type, saying, quote, "We can't buy this kind of publicity." However, this meeting fortunately did not happen thanks to Magdalena's lawyer. Nancy even claimed that Mack stated, quote, "These people essentially have a 6th grade education. Where they come from, there aren't even roads. They'll do what I tell them to do," which would be interesting, especially considering the control he had, or at least tried to have, over the family, like being Jesica's power of attorney over her health, or being the face of the family to the press. And while obviously I can only say these are alleged, I guess some confirmed things that are available of what Mack has wrote and said include a few posts on social media, as well as the things written on the Jesica Hope Chest page. Obviously, an about section on any page or website is very important. It is good to read about who founded an organization, how they came about to finding it, and what their goals for the future of the organizations are. But when looking over the things written on the page, a lot of the included information seemed to be more focused on praising Mack. For example, there's some parts that say, quote, "Mack is not the kind of man who stops to smell the roses or even rest after fighting the Goliath known as Duke, armed only with his voice and the truth." And quote, "If we had more Macks, the world would be a far more compassionate place." There was even one point on October 4th, 2010, Mack made a tweet in response to a reporter named Michelle Malkin. Michelle wrote a report on Jesica criticizing the Santillan family regarding healthcare rights and immigration. This report included some of the quotes that I mentioned earlier regarding Jesica, specifically, quote, "illegal immigrant parents suing Duke," and, quote, "taxpayers covering everything." On October 4th, 2010, Michelle made a tweet unrelated to this case, essentially saying that she came after someone before and that she was going to be coming after them again. Now, in response to this tweet, Mack replied, quote, "I'm Mack Mahoney, champion Jesica Santillan, who died at Duke in 2003. You went after her. I'm still wondering why." Thing is, the report Michelle made about Jesica was posted on February 21st, 2003, and from what I can find, there are no other posts she's made about Jesica. This means that the tweet Mack made to Michelle was posted over 7 years after Michelle wrote anything about Jesica. And it's not like the reply he made really did anything like present any facts or shut down whatever Michelle said, but it genuinely was a "I want a response" or a reaction kind of tweet. And obviously this might not be that serious, and it truly is just how you might interpret it, and you can let me know if it is a reach or not. But asking her why you came after Jesica, that part sure is fine. It was just the "I'm Mack Mahoney, champion Jesica Santillan" that could be a little odd, because the tweet could have simply just been about Jesica. Adding your name could kind of be seen as trying to get back in the limelight again. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, this doesn't prove anything about his intentions, and Mack did do amazing things with spreading Jesica's story and ensuring that some kind of justice was served for the family. It's just something to think about when seeing the allegations that were said about Mack wanting to make things about himself and the controversy with the missing money from the charity. I could see how this can make his intentions seem a bit questionable. Mack passed away on December 20th, 2021, so there's not much that can be found out directly from him about this. As for Duke University Medical Center, they actually reacted reasonably in the time after Jessica's passing. A patient safety and quality assurance committee was appointed on the health system board of directors at Duke. And this wasn't just a position created to please the masses, but the committee actually made changes. Duke added more redundancy or double checking to their procedures. They made it common practice to review information at multiple steps along the way so that large problems like receiving organs with the wrong blood type are less likely to happen again. The committee was responsible for adding a computerized system for physician orders, an internet-based reporting system, and automated surveillance to record any potential drug events. These technology-based systems make it harder for mistakes to be made, as they prompt doctors when a field is not filled out and warn when information does not match. And Duke's improved procedures put them back into compliance with the federal regulations. The United Network for Organ Sharing, or UNOS, which played a part in the transplant era, also reevaluated its procedures. They identified areas where errors could be made and tried to add more checks to it. For every organ transplant, it is now required that blood type is checked by a minimum of 2 people before the organs are released. Jessica would have been 38, turning 39 this year, and it's horrifying imagining what she went through, thinking her health and quality of life would finally change for the better, only for it to drastically get worse in her final days. Hopefully, with updated systems in place, tragedies like this could be avoided. But yes, that is it for today's video. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mysteries. Bye now.